California's beaches are home to some of America's priciest real estate. The American dream, a nice place to call your own, raise a family, and perhaps build some wealth you can pass on to your children. And yet, in the United States of today, whether that dream comes true still largely depends on the color of your skin. On average, white families have almost 8 times as much wealth as black families do. The US government calls this the racial wealth gap. That gap keeps getting worse. But where did it start? The main reason for this large and lasting gap between black and white Americans lies at the conditions surrounding the Civil War. That's the conclusion of a government study looking at the roots of the racial wealth divide. It directly traces the wealth gap back to black Americans being barred from accumulating wealth for themselves. But it didn't have to be that way. For a moment, when the Civil War was coming to an end, it looked like America was willing to fix this by giving newly freed slaves what every white settler had received: land. The pro-slavery South was almost defeated, and Union General William T. Sherman issued his famous Field Order No. 15. He declared that every freed slave family was to receive 40 acres of land, mostly confiscated from white plantation owners. It was an idea backed by Frederick Douglass, the former slave who advised Abraham Lincoln. He helped convince the president that enslaved people should not be sent back to Africa, but instead be given a stake in the land they now called home. But when Lincoln was assassinated, the new president, Andrew Johnson, overturned that 40 acres order. Johnson gave most of the seized land back to white plantation owners. Johnson had killed America's first and only attempt to give black citizens the same starting conditions as white settlers. Instead, Johnson's way of ending slavery left black Americans on the wrong side of a wealth gap that would never be closed. In 1876, Frederick Douglass decried this as a fundamental flaw in how America's enslaved were set free.
You say you have emancipated us.
But when you turned us loose, you gave us no acres.
You turned us loose to the sky, to the storm,
to the whirlwind, and worst of all,
you turned us loose to the wrath of our infuriated masters.
1.5 centuries after these words were written, America is beginning a new debate over paying reparations. Reparations is about money, but it's also about creating wealth that can be passed on to the next generation. Owning a home is the classic way to do that. Today, 72% of white Americans own a home, while only 44% of African Americans do. And while 8% of white Americans own commercial real estate, only 3% of black Americans do. More than 150 years after the abolition of slavery, pressure is mounting for action. To atone for the past, to even things up for the present, and to create more equal opportunities for the future.
So being here was immensely powerful and moving.
Vice President Kamala Harris shone White House attention on the matter in early 2023. At a port of deportation in Ghana, she made an explicit link between enslaved people and American privilege.
All of us, regardless of your background, have benefited from their struggle and their fight for freedom and for justice. Thank you.
But so far, the Biden-Harris presidency sees the question of reparations as an issue for Congress, not the president, and certainly not for a re-election campaign.
Freedom.
One reason is that, on the whole, more than 2/3 of Americans are against the idea. But within that is a huge difference of opinion, with black and white Americans almost a mirror image of each other. A Democrat bill on the issue has been stuck in Congress for years.
I hope it goes nowhere.
Why?
Reparations is something with a country that's going bankrupt. We cannot afford it, and we got other priorities that highly rank higher than that.
I just want to ask you, how much of a political priority is the whole question of reparations for you?
It's not.
Why not?
Because you have a situation in our country now where black people in America have many pathways to success, and it isn't just by giving direct money. The second part is, as a nation, we don't have a lot of money.
With no chance of a nationwide approach anytime soon, some individual communities have decided to act. I traveled across the country to meet those determined to repair at least some of the economic divide between black and white. It's here in California, the home of Tinseltown, where America will decide for the first time whether reparations will become reality or remain fiction for an entire state. This is where the drama is playing out. Manhattan Beach is a well-to-do district with a complicated history. One patch of beach ended up as a public park because of an injustice now commemorated by a plaque.
I wasn't the only one who didn't know. Yeah, there was a plaque over there, but the plaque was inaccurate and incomplete, and it seemed very whitewashed.
Charles and Willa Bruce bought land here in 1921. They got in before their white neighbors started developing an interest, and the area became known as Bruce's Beach.
Essentially what happened in the 19-teens, Charles and Willa Bruce, they came out here, they set up shop. They had a very, very small business where they sold like small things, like bathing suits and things of that nature. And then once they earned enough money, they bought another plot of land and ultimately turned their land into what is called Bruce's Beach Resort. They provided a safe space for black people. And so what happened is black people started buying property up there on what is now Bruce's Beach Park. And when the white residents saw black people taking up space and more of them coming in, they didn't like it.
In the end, the city used a provision called eminent domain to effectively disown the Bruce family. The city turned its new property into a park, while white developers around it benefited from rising real estate prices. The case of Charles and Willa Bruce is a reference point across America, like here at a conference on black land rights in Boston.
This happened all over the country. It happened all the time. And we've got a well-documented history of the government at every level, federal, state, and local, using the law and using legal means to deprive black people of property ownership, deprive black people of the right to build wealth and to transfer that wealth.
In the first deal of its kind in America, the city of Los Angeles handed the land back to the descendants of Charles and Willa Bruce 100 years after it was taken.
It symbolizes for all of us that it is always the right time to do the right thing.
Within months, the Bruce family sold the land back to the city for $20 million. But for the woman who led the fight for this to happen, that result was a disappointment. It ended up as a land deal rather than bringing black entrepreneurship into an all-white area.
I mean, I just don't like going back there because it just makes me upset to just think about And here we are, things are the same. It's unfortunate. Look up and down here. How many black people have you seen?
So it remains white?
Yes. When I moved here, there was 0.5% of black people living here, and I think it's the same now. 0.5% of black people living in the city. That's by design. You cannot tell me that's not by design. So unfortunate that white people get to pass down wealth and black people get to pass down a fight for equality and justice.
Bruce's Beach will remain a Coast Guard facility and a public park. This return of property was an exception. California itself is an American exception, as the only one of 50 states taking concrete steps towards compensating its black residents for the injustices of the past. California has launched a statewide reparations task force that is about to make recommendations to lawmakers.
This task force and DOJ is on track to deliver the final report come July 1.
It has been collecting accounts from hundreds of expert and private witnesses.
Our ancestors are the ones who built the White House, if you will. So why do we have to struggle so hard with education? This is another attack upon our people, and this is modern day slavery.
Seems to me free health care, free education, tax-exempt status, land allocation, and a check could have longevity.
Financial experts told the commission that with interest, just the wages that America owes its formerly enslaved people would amount to $20 billion. The figures are daunting, yet Democrat-governed California looks determined to make history and do something.
We don't tell folks to get over the Holocaust. We don't tell them to get over, the Armenian genocide or the internment of Japanese during World War II. All of those entities were compensated at some level. This country would not be what it is today if it weren't for the African slave. If California can't get it done, it's going to be hard on the national level. So I think we are the litmus test.
America is watching closely how California will go in handing back black-owned land and handing out reparations. My next stop is in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in a town still grappling with the legacy of America's worst racial massacre more than a century ago. The city of Tulsa is rich, oil-rich, but to this day, there's a deep wealth drop when you cross the rail lines into the north of the city. That's where the Tulsa Massacre erased an entire area. It's called Greenwood, but many called it Black Wall Street. Today, a museum testifies to how a once vibrant quarter with black-owned shops and businesses promised black wealth until their white neighbors burnt it down in 1921. As so often, violence was sparked by a rumor that a black boy may have come too close to a white girl. Within hours, armed white men, authorized by the sheriff, attacked Tulsa's Greenwood district. They dropped turpentine bombs from private planes. The attack killed hundreds of people and destroyed rows of businesses and homes. Those who could fled. The community would never recover, and the effects can still be felt today.
Facts are facts. The truth of what has happened in places like Tulsa are manifest in what you see in disproportionate crime rates, disproportionate health rates, disproportionate wealth rates. And we want to be able to inform current leaders and future leaders that these things have had an impact. Now you are armed with information, go make change.
The city has invested in more historical research. It also recently launched a process to hear from Tulsans what they'd like the city to do beyond an apology. Tulsa's mayor, G.T. Bynum, declined our request for an interview. He has so far not committed to any form of reparations. That's why the only remaining survivors of the massacre, all older than 100 years, are taking the city to court. 2 years ago, at the age of 107, Viola Fletcher told U.S. Congress of how the massacre on May the 31st, 1921, destroyed her community.
We lost everything that day, our homes, our churches, our newspapers, our theaters, our lives. Greenwood represented all the best of what was possible for black people in America and for all the people. No one cared about us for almost 100 years.
The 3 remaining survivors have already been turned down by a court once. It ruled that what happened was too long ago for the case to go ahead. I went to see the legal team who are on the second case, which keeps getting delayed by the court.
The city and the Chamber of Commerce and the Tulsa Regional Authority are now trying to get the last 3 survivors kicked out of the case. They've been dragging their heels, filing motions. I think the playbook is the same now as it was in 2003, which is waiting for the survivors to die.
That neighborhood of Greenwood has also been subjected to another trauma, this time at the hands of city planners.
In the 1970s, they ran a freeway through the middle of it and split the community again, and what was there fell apart.
The home these stairs led up to was destroyed decades after the Tulsa massacre as part of the so-called urban renewal program. Starting in the 1960s, Black-owned houses in Greenwood were torn down to make way for a highway, a new university campus, new infrastructure, it was argued, that serves all.
I'm a realtor. I know where things are, right? It brings tears to my eyes when I think about it on their behalf. Because when someone comes and says, yeah, my grandma's hairdressing salon used to be right there, and they're pointing at a freeway overpass, it's very, very saddening. It's very saddening. Yeah.
The erasure of Black entrepreneurship several times over has left Greenwood unable to rebuild itself. Legal scholars see this as a landmark case that shines a spotlight on why Black Americans are still so much poorer.
There's a narrative that these are just irresponsible people, and it's too bad that they are not doing well, socially and economically, but it's kind of their fault, right? In Tulsa, with what we call the Black Wall Street, these folks, they weren't taking government handouts. They, through their hard work, vision, initiative, creativity, stick-to-itiveness, built something incredibly successful. And so I think just having that counter-narrative to what often is, victim blaming we have in this country is powerful.
And yet pursuing justice through the courts isn't working. The legal successor of those who actually conducted the violence, killing hundreds and razing Greenwood to the ground, well, that's the city of Tulsa. The legal process there is stuck. A century after the worst racial massacre in US history, Tulsa isn't just a reminder of the cruelty of the past, but also the inaction that amounts to indifference in the present. And a century later, the state where it all happened, Oklahoma, is only just beginning to debate whether there should be anything more than an apology. From Tulsa, I head to Providence, Rhode Island. This region was one of the key slave ports of colonial America. By the end of the 18th century, some 1,000 ships arrived here, bringing around 100,000 enslaved people. They delivered African men, women, and children into lives of abuse and cultural oppression. Providence's City Hall was testimony to the wealth accumulated and passed down those ruling generations. Many leading figures, still regarded as Rhode Island's founding fathers, made their fortunes during this time. Even abolition continued the inequality. Compensation was only paid to slave owners. Much of this was built on the slave trade, and while slave traders themselves usually received compensation for their losses, the people who suffered and died and their descendants received absolutely nothing. 1.5 centuries later, the city has decided to take a step towards reparations and put $10 million into a fund.
It would take tens of millions of dollars. You can't do it just with 10 million. So, but yet you don't want to not do anything. So, we were able to get 10 million, which is $10 million more than we had. And I have a housing background, so in terms of generational wealth, most generational wealth in this country is created by home ownership.
Today, only half as many Black Rhode Islanders own their home as the overall average. Local historian and businessman Keith Stokes is one of the experts who recommended how to use the reparations budget. He wants to see grants to help Black Americans move back to the areas where they should have been able to thrive all this time.
So tell us about this area. What did it used to be and what is it today?
Well, we're standing at the corners. This is Meeting Street and Cognon Street. In fact, that's the Cognon Street Baptist Church. The Cognon Street Baptist Church evolved from one of the earliest African meeting houses in America from the 17th and 18th century. And one of the great ironies of racialized discrimination is not only the physical subjugation through slavery, but it's removing people of color from the very place where they lived, worked, and worshiped.
And later, Black efforts to buy property were hit with policies like redlining. These set out where you had to live to get help buying a house.
Here in the city of Providence, we have a 1935 redline map, and it shows this neighborhood and other neighborhoods which are predominantly low income and predominantly Black were excluded from any access to federal mortgage insurance or any opportunity to own a home, and most importantly, build equity in that home. This is not slavery of the 18th century. This is federal, state, city, public policies and practices in the mid-20th century.
So again, while the slavery era created a wealth gap, policies that followed deepened this economic divide between Black and white. Dozens of towns and cities around the US have admitted that they had policies that actively deepened the economic divide along those ethnic lines. Only a few of them have so far committed to any form of reparations.
We really need to address the fundamental narrative, and we need to understand that the actions that took place, not by you and not to me, but those actions that took place 100 years ago, you can draw a straight line between those actions and the wealth disparities between Black and white households today.
To this day, mostly without realizing, ordinary Americans are surrounded by the wealth created by enslaved people. Both the Capitol and the White House were built using their forced labor. American society is still far from recognizing that this inequality persists and that it won't just go away. We've seen 3 regional attempts at making amends through reparations. The question now is whether that will ever grow into something like a national approach. It's a question left unanswered from the days of the first freed enslaved people 1.5 centuries ago. Back then, Frederick Douglass said the answer would show whether America lives up to its stated values.
We are here, and that this is our country.
And the question for the philosophers and the statesmen of the land ought to be,
what principles should dictate the policy of the action towards us? We shall neither die out nor be driven out, but shall go with this people,
either as a testimony against them or as an evidence in their favor,
throughout their generations. That's the legacy of Greenwood, and that's the purpose of where we're standing.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.